Hi everyone, I'm Mary. Today we're going to analyze 10 specific points about the legend of Khiimori. These are behind-the-scenes details and design choices that change how we perceive the environment and gameplay. If you're interested in how the game was structured and want a more detailed look at these mechanics, join me in this video. Let's get straight to the points. Horse genetics is the kind of detail that immediately shifts my mindset from pretty horse game to, yes, this is a real system. The Legend of Khiimori has an official Steam page, so I already view this proposal as something the team wants to put at the center of the experience, not just an extra thrown on top. What I like most about this idea is that it gives your steed an identity. It's not just about picking the fastest one and being done with it. If each horse is born with its own tendencies, you start to observe, compare, and create a bond based on actual performance, not just aesthetics. And that's where the most addictive part comes in. When the environment matters, you stop thinking of the horse as a vehicle and start thinking of it as a strategic partner. I imagine myself testing a foal that handles heavy terrain better, another that does well in the cold, another that is more explosive in sprints, and suddenly, every route becomes an experiment. Now, my more grounded side also loves this because it creates stories that only happen in your save file, like that horse that wasn't the most promising but trained so well for what you needed that it became your favorite choice. That's an emergent narrative that no cutscene can deliver the same way. The Legend of Khiimori immediately steps away from the obvious. You don't enter as a war hero, but as a rider messenger for the Yam system. This choice totally changes the vibe, because your weapon becomes time, the right route, and trust in your horse. To me, this gives a different weight to every delivery. It's not about defeating someone, it's about not failing the message. I imagine the tension of carrying vital information across a massive empire with weather, terrain, and distance constantly trying to slow you down. The Yam, as a postal system linked to Genghis Khan's empire, has always sounded to me almost like a medieval internet, a network designed for information to circulate fast. When the game uses this idea, the adventure gains a really cool professional side because you're fulfilling a real function, not just collecting combat feats. And there's a detail I really like. Being a messenger puts you in a more grounded type of heroism. Instead of being the person who changes the world with a sword, you become the person who keeps the world running, a constant race between responsibility and freedom on the road. This detail of having to balance cargo weight, almost like in Death Stranding, is what transforms every delivery into a mini survival mission, rather than just going from point A to B. When the game makes you think about where you place every bag in every box, whether it goes on the saddle or the character, it's constantly reminding you that logistics are just as important as skill. I love it when a game forces you to plan before you simply hit the run button. What makes this even more interesting is the direct impact on the horse. It's not just a stamina bar going down for the sake of it. If you overdo the load or distribute the weight poorly, the animal trips, gets overly exhausted, and you feel the weight of your irresponsibility. This completely changes the relationship with the horse because it stops being just my means of transport and becomes someone you need to protect while you work. This type of mechanic also creates a different pace of exploration. Instead of picking up everything that appears along the way like a loot vacuum, you start to think, is it worth taking this? Can I sustain this weight until the next post? Isn't it better to prioritize something lighter but more valuable? And so the journey itself becomes the challenge, not just what awaits at the end of the route. Personally, I really enjoy when a game puts you on that edge between greed and care. You want to maximize the load to make the trip worth it, but at the same time, you know that if you overdo it, you'll jeopardize the horse, the delivery time, and even your own safety. That feeling of always being on the razor's edge, adjusting every kilogram, perfectly matches the premise of being a messenger on the steppe. You aren't just fast, you are responsible for what you carry and for who takes you there. When I discovered what Khiimori means, the game's title immediately clicked in my head. It's not just a pretty name, it's a spiritual concept from Mongolian culture. In interviews and official materials, Khiimori appears as the wind horse, an entity linked to shamanistic imagery and the breath of life, something much greater than simply a horse. And the coolest part is how this speaks directly to the game's central fantasy. You aren't just traversing 13th century Mongolia as a messenger, you're crossing it with a companion that carries symbolic weight. The game's own description speaks of this wind horse as something mythical and describes Khiimori as the spirit of the earth and sky, highlighting this almost sacred bond between rider and mount. To me, this choice of name changes the interpretation of every trip. When the wind picks up, when the route goes wrong, when you push just a little harder to reach your destination, it feels less like a riding sim and more like a journey of courage. In some cultural explanations, Khiimori is treated as a force of spirit, inspiration, and bravery, as if the wind horse is the untamable part of you that pushes you forward. So when someone says the name refers to the spirit of the horse, I totally get what they mean. It's the idea that the steed isn't a tool, it's a bond. And that makes the connection between messenger and mount much more personal, because the game starts by telling you, in the title itself, exactly what true legend you are carrying with you on the road. The game forces you to think like someone who truly depends on their horse to live, not like an action hero who solves everything with a punch. The game's core premise is to put you on a long journey through 13th century Mongolia alongside your horse, with combat kept very much in the background. This completely changes how you read the map. Every valley, every weather shift, every cold night becomes a much more psychological challenge than, will I be able to beat everyone? When the game asks you to look after the horse's health, temperature, and feeding, it's basically saying, this partner is your lifeline. Treat them well. I really like this because it forces you to slow down, observe the environment, and choose your route with shelter, water, and rest in mind. It's not just looking at the mini-map and following a line. It's feeling that the landscape can be either your enemy or your ally, depending on how you prepare. To me, limited combat is a very clear message. If you're fighting too much, you're probably playing wrong within the fantasy the game wants to provide. Instead of thinking, how do I defeat this danger, you start thinking, how do I get through here without encountering this danger? This inversion makes everything tenser because fleeing, bypassing, waiting for the right time, or even retreating a bit ends up being smarter than jumping into a fight. And that's exactly where the game gains its own unique feel. Survival becomes a routine of constant small decisions. Even simple things like choosing whether to push the horse faster on an open stretch or save its energy because there's a heavy climb ahead end up becoming micro-strategies. In the end, you don't just get attached to the landscape or the story, you get attached to the feeling of always being one step away from trouble, taking care of yourself and your horse as if you were a single organism trying to cross that massive world. The weather and wind aren't just pretty Unreal Engine 5 effects, they actually mess with your head while you play. When the wind starts hitting harder across the steppes and the grass bends entirely in front of you, you feel that the world is reacting to your presence, but also testing you. It's not just visually impressive, it's the kind of detail that makes you slow down and think, okay, crossing this isn't going to be that simple. When you add snowy mountains to the equation, it gains a whole new weight. I imagine that feeling of losing visibility, the cold affecting the horse, the terrain getting heavier, and suddenly a climb that seemed easy becomes a real obstacle. The coolest part is that in a game focused on being a messenger and survival, snow isn't just scenery, it's a constant danger. You start choosing routes that are less beautiful but safer, just to avoid putting your steed at risk. Meanwhile, in the deserts, the vibe changes entirely. That open horizon, wind carrying sand, heat slowly draining energy. It seems like the kind of biome where you need to respect time, plan for water, rest, and perhaps even the time of day you risk moving forward. I really enjoy it when a game makes you feel that each region has its own personality, rather than just a different skin over the same gameplay. This weather and wind system gives the impression that the map isn't a static board, it's a living organism, reacting to every trip you take. For a game that revolves around long crossings, this is perfect. You aren't just repeating paths, you are relearning the same roads under different conditions. Every gust of wind, every sudden change in weather becomes a story you remember later, not because an enemy was waiting for you, but because the world itself decided to put you to the test at that moment. In the game, the bow and arrow are not used for combat, but as tools for survival and gathering. This says a lot about the worldview the Legend of Khiimori wants to convey. In Mongolian culture, an animal isn't just a resource. It has a spirit, it has value, and hunting or culling requires a consciousness that goes beyond just pulling a trigger and moving on. What I find most beautiful about this mechanic is that it places you in a position of emotional responsibility. You don't pick up the bow because you want to destroy something. You pick it up because you need to, and that completely changes the feeling of every moment with it in your hands. Imagine having to make that conscious choice to cull an animal, knowing the game reminds you that this has a cost beyond the inventory, a cost that reflects the respect Mongolian culture itself dedicated to the life around it. This philosophy also connects very well with the rest of the game. If combat is limited, if you avoid dangers instead of facing them head-on, it makes total sense for the bow and arrow to follow the same logic. Use them only when necessary, with care and intention. This creates a much more contemplative game rhythm where every action has weight, and there isn't that map-clearing mentality we see in so many other titles. To me, this is the kind of detail that transforms a good game into a memorable experience. When a game makes you think before you shoot, when it places intention and respect into the simplest act of survival, it is teaching you something about the culture it represents. And honestly, I prefer this kind of depth 1,000 times over having another generic combat system thrown on top of a beautiful world. Instead of being just a linear story you follow from point A to point B, the game seems to want your routine as a messenger to be as much a part of the narrative as any cutscene. Every day on the step, every decision about a route, rest, or risk you take becomes a little piece of your own story within that world. I really like it when a game lets the journey breathe like this. When they talk about a life system, I imagine moments that aren't epic in the traditional sense, but end up leaving a mark. A night where you almost got stuck in a blizzard, an unexpected encounter at a camp, a crossing that took longer than you planned. These are small events, but added up, they shape who your character becomes and how you view that nomadic life. At the same time, having this base anchored in the legends and nomadic Mongolian culture gives a much more spiritual layer to it all. It's not just surviving on the road, it's surviving while carrying stories, myths, and traditions that blend into your daily life. I think it's really cool when a game makes you feel like you're living a normal routine within a world that has something sacred about it, as if any trip could suddenly stumble upon something legendary. In the end, this combination of your in-game life events with a narrative drawn from legends creates a feeling that your journey is unique, yet still part of something bigger. You aren't just the protagonist of a pre-written script. You are someone building their own story among a people who already carries centuries of stories before you. And that feeling of being just one more flame in the fire, but with experiences that only you have lived, is one of the coolest ways to tell a good story in a video game. When I see that The Legend of Khiimori is by Aesir Interactive, I immediately connect it to their experience with horse games through the Windstorm series. This isn't a studio that chose this theme randomly. They have worked before specifically on simulators focused on the relationship between rider and mount. This changes how I approach the game slightly. Instead of expecting a generic horse just for locomotion, I go in imagining that things like movement, acceleration, braking, and terrain response will have a minimum level of technical care. It's not a promise of perfection, but it's a more solid starting point than a studio with no history in the genre. I also find it interesting how that Windstorm background combines with the more messenger routine-centered proposal of Khiimori. Instead of just reusing knowledge to make another horse sim, they put that know-how into a larger context: long-distance travel, weather, survival, and Mongolian culture. It gives the feeling that the horse remains at the center, but is now part of a much wider world. For those playing, this all means you can pay attention to finer details without expecting the game to resolve itself through combat or entirely different systems. When you know there's a traditional Mongolian band involved and a Morin-Hur master working on the music, you can view each track less as simple background music and more as part of the game's identity. It doesn't just accompany the trip, it comments on what is happening around you. I love the idea of the soundtrack adapting to the biomes because it fits perfectly with a game where you spend so much time just riding and staring at the horizon. In the steppes, I imagine something more open, almost contemplative. In the desert, drier, repetitive rhythms that give that sense of distance. And in the snowy mountains, something slower, almost melancholic. Even without an action scene happening, just this change in tone holds your attention. Another thing that catches my eye is how this speaks to the game's historical period. You are crossing 13th century Mongolia in a messenger's routine, and the soundtrack doesn't use modern instruments trying to make everything epic, but anchors itself in sounds that make sense for that context. This helps immensely with getting into the nomadic life vibe, because the music seems to come from that world, not from outside of it. This type of soundtrack ends up working almost like a silent narrator of your journey. When the wind changes, the biome changes, and the music follows, you feel that the journey is moving through chapters, even without anyone explaining anything in text. It's the kind of detail that doesn't scream in your face, but completely changes how you remember each route, precisely because the sound of it stays stuck in your memory along with the landscape.